Hello, Neopians. So, in the past couple of weeks, I have shared with you my tips for the art gallery as well as the poetry contest on Neopets. And this week, I want to take a look at one of my favorite parts of the site, which is the Neopian Times. As a kid, it was like my biggest dream to get published in the Neopian Times, especially when they released that really cute wee woo avatar for, I think, the 200th edition. And at the time, I really wanted to be an author. This was my dream. And I remembered that my dad had this typewriter, and I wrote my story on the typewriter. This story, which was like two paragraphs long. And then I didn't understand that you couldn't take the typewriter version and put it into the computer. So then I wrote it out into the computer, into the text box submission field, and hit submit. And then I didn't realize that you wouldn't be able to save it. So, let's just say it was a dream deferred. And flash forward 20 years later when I never thought I'd be playing Neopets again, but I am and loving it. And I've retackled this challenge that felt impossible. And then I've, obviously been able to conquer that mountain. So, I guess in this journey for me, which has been over a year now, I have assembled some tips that I'd like to share with you for, again, conquering the contest itself, as well as kind of having the right mentality for the long journey ahead, especially if you're going for the avatars. Especially the one where you have to get published 10 times, that's going to take quite a while, and you're going to be dealing with a lot of anxiety, potential rejection if you view it as such. So, as we dig into this presentation, I'll have some tips on the mentality, as well as the technical craft. And to conclude, I'm going to try to write an article live with all of y'all. So, I hope you're excited for that. Now, as I've mentioned in my other videos, the rewards for getting published in the Neopian Times are quite similar to the other creative contests on site. You will get a trophy for your lookup. If you get published multiple times, the trophy count will increase, which is, you know, like a badge of honor that you can, take pride in. There are prizes from the creative contest pool, which include the likes of the Colt Sand stamp, for example, as well as a few other stamps. Again, those are the rare prizes. There are a lot of dud prizes like pet paintbrushes, regular paintbrushes, even codestones and Nerc mids. So it's about a 3% chance of you getting an outrageous prize like the Colt Sand stamp, but it is an incentive. And then obviously, lastly, there's the whole creative community on site. I suggest checking out the writer boards in particular for the Neopian Times, but the creative community is also over on the art boards as well. But with the Neopian Times, there are actually some unique rewards that you can access that are exclusive to the publication. As I've mentioned before, there are these, I guess more elite avatars, more difficult avatars to obtain. The one on the left with the quill is called the NT Star avatar. You can get that avatar after getting published 10 times in the Neopian Times, which is quite a lofty goal. If you are shooting for this avatar, I would manage your expectations. Most people don't get published 10 times in a row. I'd say maybe 90% of people don't get published 10 times in a row, right? In all likelihood, this avatar is going to take you a year to complete. So, view it as a long term process. And if you view your journey in this regard as building a creative process, it's going to be more sanity inducing. I don't know the words, but um, if you just kind of accept that it's not going to be a quick path, it's going to help you with your confidence and manage your emotions further down the road. The other avatar, the wee woo one, which I mentioned, is an avatar awarded for getting published in a special edition of the Neopian Times. Specifically, it's one, as of now in the new modern era of Neopets, it's once every 25 editions. The Neopian Times is published once every 2 weeks, so this occurs about once a year. Um, and so, you could see the chances. There are some people who never submit and they submit to the special edition and they get in and they get the Weeboo avatar right off the bat. That wasn't the case for me. I submitted, didn't get in, but in the process of trying to become a better creator specifically for the publication, and shooting for the NT Star avatar instead, I kind of built my capability up so that when the next opportunity came around, I was kind of ready to claim it. So um, that's how you get those two avatars. And in addition to those two avatars, there are some exclusive prizes awarded for the Neopian Times. Some special publications come with a bonus prize. For example, Illucinde will come with a woodland pet paintbrush. Um, Halloween, I think, comes with the Poogle transmogrification potion. The biggest or most valuable exclusive prize is this Neopian Times coin, which is worth about 300 million Neo points. So, um, unlike the other creative contests, the Neopian Times has some exclusive prizes, and that could be a bonus incentive to try for getting published. So, again, before I dive into these tips, I'm just going to preface that these are not an exhaustive list. After all, the Neopian Times rewards many different types of works that have their own nuances. For example, there are comics, which are, they might appeal for more visual artists. There are articles and short stories, which are shorter works. And then there's multi part series, which are longer narrative works. So again, the goal of this video is to provide you with the tools with which you can begin to create, understand, and articulate your own creative process. So the number one tip is to plan ahead. Um, uh, Needless to say, given the amount of work it takes to create an issue of the Neopian Times for the editor, um, it's best that you don't submit on the publication date, right? You should be having your entries prepared in advance so that the editor can review them and consider them for each edition. So to know when to submit, you must consult the Neopian Times schedule on the Neo boards. And in this graphic, I've shown the Neopian Writer Neo boards, and the topics that are published by TNT members will be highlighted in blue. So you can see this blue Neopian Times schedule, which I've also, had created a zoomed in kind of graphic to kind of show you. So sometimes they fall onto page 2 of the boards. And so if you're not seeing anything in blue, just click on page 2 and you'll find it there. But when you click into one of those threads, you will find the specific schedule, which will include a list of issues, dates, and their themes, if there are any themes that go along with it. So if you look at this screenshot of a schedule, you could see that on April 4th, there was a special April Fool's edition of the Neopian Times. It was edition 1030. So all content for the edition published on April 4th should be April Fool's themed. Meanwhile, conversely, on April 18th, the issue after, which is today's date, is a normal, or sometimes it's referred to as a random edition of the Neopian Times. That means all types of content are able to be submitted. Now, the difference between a themed and a non themed issue, um, themed issues tend to be larger. They might be double the size of a non themed issue. They might have two rounds of acceptances and kind of go through the entries twice and submit, again, acceptances in two different batches. And, as I mentioned before, there may be exclusive prizes awarded for those special themes. Given that the themed issues accept almost double the amount of entries in most cases, you could try to prioritize the themed issues in a year and likely rack up 10 wins for the NT Star avatar that way, in all likelihood. So I know there are some people that only plan to do that strategy. I kind of submitted for every edition that came up, but I did find that maybe 2/3 of all my acceptances came on those themed days myself. So in terms of, again, this schedule, if there is a themed edition and you're submitting a non-themed piece, the likelihood of that piece getting accepted is very minimal. So it is important to plan ahead, because you may be the number of times I see people post on the Neo boards, oh, I didn't realize this was a themed edition. I was really hoping for my short story about X to get in. The amount of emotional energy and anxiety that this person, consumes for an edition that is going to have a set theme, it's disheartening to see those stories. So, that's another reason to keep that in mind. And in terms of when to submit, so if you see on this schedule, for example, each edition is published 2 weeks after the next. So, for example, today's April 18th. There's an edition of the Neopian Times that should be published today. It was actually published yesterday in a very bizarre circumstance due to the Easter holiday. But the earliest you could submit is when that publication is submitted. To be safe, I typically submit 24 hours after, because they clear the backlog of all entries and delete those. So I like to wait 24 hours, and that way I have a submission that's in early. Now, the latest you can submit is about the Monday before publication. So in the case of this April 18th issue that was this week, the latest I would have advised submitting was Monday, April, I believe it's 13th. Typically, announcements come out on Tuesdays or Wednesdays. There are some unusual cases, but I guess the idea is if you submit late, the reviewer has maybe already had some ideas of which pieces they could be accepting, and they may not be able to fit your entry in. So typically, I'd say earlier is better, and you can submit as early as the date in which the previous issue is published. So, for example, if I had an Illusin themed piece, and the Illusin day is March 21st, I would not submit that piece on March 1st. It wouldn't carry over, because if I submit on March 1st, there was an issue published on March 7th, the entries would be cleared and it wouldn't carry over to the next issue. So if you have any questions on that, please leave them in the comments. I think that's a very common question I see on the Neo boards, but it is very important for you to be aware of the schedule, when to submit, and to submit in the time period where it matters. Now, again, this kind of fits in with the themes, but my next tip is to be topical. For themed issues, be sure to fit the theme. Now, I kind of provided some example themes that are quite common below. For example, there was the April Fool's theme, which could be potentially a difficult theme to think of a topic for. But you could go with maybe Nick Neopia, who has been a common character in the April Fool's Day pranks that TNT has done over the years, or you could pick maybe a comedian in Neopia, such as the Bloomeroo court jester, for example, and maybe write a story, an article from that person's perspective, or a comic. Pet Day, you could write maybe an article about the tips for caring for pets, or you could even make a comic starring maybe Termaculus, the king of pets, Florg, an article about Florg who eats pets and which pets are the yummiest. Um, that's some examples there. And then Halloween, I think there are a lot of spooky characters in Neopia, or maybe you might even call them villains. You could write a piece about Muka or Count Von Roo. But even if there's a non themed issue, my tip would still be to be topical. So for a non themed issue, an issue that, again, anything can be accepted and submitted, I'd say that the editors like to accept pieces that center around current events in Neopia, whether they be on site or in the Neopian culture offsite. So, let's say it's around the time of the Advent calendar, or for example, right now, it's around the time of the Festival of Negs, creating content that taps into what's happening right now kind of increases your likelihood of getting accepted. Another example of maybe the offsite culture would be when the dead Shia was kind of a big meme. Maybe it's always a big meme, but it definitely had a huge moment this year, creating content about the dead Shia. It would certainly be a good idea. So the next tip would be to pick a format. And again, just as a reminder, there are 4 different categories of content that are accepted by the Neopian Times. There are articles. Articles could be, written from your perspective and be quite informational, but they can also be fictional. There are comics. There are multi-part series, and short stories. And within these types of content, there are different formats that can be successful. So, for example, with articles, a lot of lists, guides, or interviews get published. For comics, there are some dramatic comics, there are some kind of maybe twee or inspirational and cute comics. And then there's obviously kind of funnier comics. Maybe they incorporate some sort of meme. And then in terms of short stories, there are typical kind of like hero's journey style stories. There are maybe sequels to some lore that happened on site, or prequels to that type of lore. I would say that whether you pick to make an article, a comic, short story, or series, um, read the most recent issues and see what type of content has gotten in. And there's no need to reinvent the wheel, especially when you're starting out. Try to emulate some sort of format that you see. For example, if you see a list that's written in a certain way, try to emulate creating a list that way. So that way you can, learn more about what is accepted and what appeals to the editor, for example. And over time, you're going to add your own twists and style on top of these formats as well. Now, no matter which category or format you pick, I think it's very important to have a clear voice and make sure that a specific voice rather than a generic voice shines through. That voice could be your voice. Maybe you are writing an opinion piece about something that is highly relevant to Neopia today. Maybe it's the Altador Cup. Maybe you are a devout fan of a certain team and you want to articulate um, why you are part of that fandom. Maybe I'm writing a short story and I've created my own character. Um, Let us into the head of that character rather than just walking us through a chain of events that that character is experiencing. And this last idea is my favorite that I like to incorporate into articles, which is pick a famous Neopian's voice to emulate. Um, it could be someone like, Termaculus, for example. I wrote an article about pet cuisine written by him as if it was written by him. Or you could pick more obscure characters. I think for April Fool's Day and Halloween, I wrote from the perspective of Xenia, Master Prankster, who's just a character from a Neo deck card. And there was a lot of freedom to to work with that idea. But I think that having a clear voice adds another layer of interest and intrigue onto the piece that kind of can make your content stand out from the rest of the pack. If someone else wrote a very similar idea as yours, the unique voice is what's going to set it apart from the rest. And my last tip, which is important, which is to not get discouraged. Again, as I mentioned before, getting into the Neopian Times isn't an overnight achievement. I'd say most people don't get in their first time. Most people get in their third, fourth, or fifth time. When you're not getting in, I wouldn't focus on quitting. I'd actually focus on creating more content. By creating more content, you are going to get better. And I don't know, some people don't get accepted. They seem to call it a rejection, which I understand why they feel that way, but it's not the same thing. There's only so much space for the editor to fit in. And if you view it as a rejection, then it is a rejection because you're rejecting yourself. I think some people I see maybe hyperfixate on just revising the same piece over and over again. But I would say someone who's written 5 pieces will revise a piece much better than someone who has only written 1 piece and is revising, but they don't know what needs to really improve, for example. And, while you are working on, again, this long term goal, um, and you're making more content, you can get more mileage out of your content by, again, revising it within reason, reusing your pieces. Maybe there's a guide to caring for pets that you can change to Halloween pets for the Halloween theme, for example. And again, recycling your content as well. So I think that brings us to the end of just the general guide portion. Again, these are really high level tips that are meant to be able to be applied to any type of piece that you're creating, whether it's, again, more visual like a comic or written like a article, story, short story, nonfiction or fiction.